The scent of burning bacon fat woke Adelaide Lawson before dawn, but it wasn't coming from her own kitchen. Someone had started a fire in the alley behind the boarding house, and from the sound of cursing drifting through her window, they were making a poor job of breakfast. She rose from her narrow cot, dressed quickly in the dim light, and twisted her dark blonde hair into a practical bun before heading downstairs to the cookhouse that had become her entire world since arriving in Panamint, California, 6 months ago in the spring of 1875. The mining camp sprawled across the Panamint Valley like a wound in the earth, all raw timber and canvas tents, filled with men who had come seeking silver and found mostly dust, backbreaking labor, and dreams that grew thinner with each passing day. Adelaide had come here with her father, a prospector who'd convinced himself that this time, this claim, would be the one that changed their fortunes. He died 3 weeks after their arrival, crushed in a shaft collapse that also took 4 other men. She'd buried him on a hillside overlooking the valley, spent her last $5 on a wooden cross, and then faced the reality that she was alone in a town of 1,500 men with exactly 32 cents to her name. The boarding house owner, a hard woman named Mrs. Garrett, had offered her a position cooking for the miners who rented rooms. The pay was insulting, barely enough to cover her own board with a few pennies left over, but Adelaide had no other options. She cooked 3 meals a day for 20 to 30 men, depending on how many had worked that week. She rose at 4 in the morning to start the fires, baked bread, fried bacon and eggs, made pots of beans and cornbread for lunch, and served stew or roast meat for dinner when Mrs. Garrett's budget allowed for it, which wasn't often. The miners paid Mrs. Garrett 25 cents per meal, and Adelaide saw only a fraction of that, her wages calculated at a rate that kept her perpetually on the edge of destitution. She'd been stirring a pot of oatmeal, adding precious cinnamon that she'd purchased with her own meager savings, because the miners deserved something better than the flavorless gruel Mrs. Garrett insisted was sufficient when she first saw him. He'd appeared in the doorway of the cookhouse like something from another era, so out of place among the coal-dusted miners that several men actually stopped eating to stare. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad he had to turn slightly to fit through the door frame. His hair was dark brown and fell past his collar, tied back with a leather cord, and his face was weathered from years of sun and wind. He wore buckskin trousers and a heavy shirt that couldn't quite conceal the powerful muscles of his chest and arms. A hunting knife hung at his belt alongside a well-maintained Colt revolver, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who'd spent more time in the wilderness than in civilization. Adelaide had frozen with her ladle halfway to a bowl, aware that every eye in the room was now on this stranger. He surveyed the room with eyes the color of smoke, gray with flecks of blue, and when his gaze landed on her, something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but a softening around the edges. "Madam," he said, his voice deep and rough from disuse, "I'm told this is where a man can get breakfast." 25 cents, Adelaide replied, finding her voice though her heart was beating strangely fast. "Oatmeal, bacon, eggs if we have them, coffee and bread." He crossed the room in 3 long strides, and she noticed that despite his size, he moved with the fluid grace of a predator. He placed a gold coin on the counter in front of her, a $5 eagle that gleamed in the morning light streaming through the window. "Keep it," he said. "I'll take whatever you're serving, and I'll take it again for lunch and dinner if you're willing." Adelaide stared at the coin. $5 was more than she made in 2 weeks. "Sir, this is too much. The meals are 25 cents each, so even 3 meals a day for a week wouldn't cost this much. Consider the extra payment for the cinnamon," he said, and this time he did smile, just barely. Been a long time since I've had anything that smelled half that good. She wanted to refuse, wanted to maintain some shred of pride, but $5 meant she could save enough to perhaps, eventually, leave Panamint. It meant she could buy better ingredients, maybe even keep a bit for herself without feeling guilty. Her fingers closed around the coin. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I'll make sure you get your money's worth." His name was Russell Jennings, and over the next few days, Adelaide learned his story in fragments. He was a mountain man, one of the last of his kind who trapped and hunted in the high Sierra Nevada. He'd come down to Panamint to trade his furs and restock his supplies before heading back into the mountains. The other miners gave him a wide berth, whether out of respect or wariness, Adelaide couldn't tell. He took his meals alone at a corner table, eating with the methodical focus of someone who'd known real hunger, and he always thanked her when she brought his food. On the third day, he was still there, and Adelaide began to wonder if his business in town was taking longer than expected, or if there was another reason for his continued presence. She was kneading dough for the lunch bread when he approached the kitchen counter, holding his empty coffee cup. "Could I trouble you for more coffee, Miss Lawson?" he asked. She startled at hearing her name. "You know who I am?" "Asked around," he admitted. "Figured I should know the name of the woman who makes the best biscuits I've ever tasted." Heat rose to her cheeks. "They're just biscuits, Mr. Jennings." "Russell," he corrected. "And they're a damn sight better than just biscuits, pardon my language." She poured his coffee, aware of his eyes on her. "How long are you staying in Panamint?" "Haven't decided yet," he said. "Came here to sell furs and buy supplies, but I'm finding the town has more to offer than I expected." The way he looked at her when he said it made her hands shake slightly. She set down the coffee pot and met his gaze directly. "Mr. Jennings, I appreciate your generous payment for meals, but if you're staying on my account, you should know that I'm just a cook with nothing to offer a man like you." "A man like me," he repeated, something unreadable in his expression. "And what kind of man do you think I am, Adelaide?" The use of her first name sent a shiver down her spine. "I think you're a man used to the freedom of the mountains, and I'm a woman trapped in a mining camp cookhouse working for pennies. We live in different worlds." "Maybe," he allowed. "Or maybe I'm just a man who knows quality when he sees it, whether it's in a meal or in a person." He picked up his coffee cup. "I'll be staying a while longer. Got some things to think about." That afternoon, while Adelaide was preparing dinner, Mrs. Garrett swept into the kitchen with her usual sour expression. "That mountain man has been asking questions about you," she announced. "Wanted to know about your circumstances, your character. I told him you were a decent enough girl who'd fallen on hard times." "Why would he ask about me?" Adelaide said, though her pulse quickened. "Men like that don't ask questions without reason," Mrs. Garrett said sharply. "You do well to remember that you're under my roof and I won't have any scandal." "There's no scandal," Adelaide protested. "He's just a customer." "Customers don't pay in gold for meals worth pennies," Mrs. Garrett countered. "You be careful, girl. Men want things from women and they'll pay handsomely for it, but there's always a price on your end too." The warning sat heavy in Adelaide's stomach as she finished preparing the evening meal. She'd been alone since her father's death, and while the loneliness was a constant ache, she'd learned to be wary. Panamint was not a gentle place, and women without protection were vulnerable in ways that kept her awake at night. She'd seen what happened to women who trusted the wrong men, who believed promises whispered in the dark. But when Russell came for dinner that evening, there was nothing predatory in his manner. He ate her pot roast and potatoes, complimented the gravy, and left another gold coin on the table before departing. Adelaide stared at the money, torn between gratitude and confusion. The next morning she found him waiting outside the cookhouse before dawn, standing in the purple half-light with a bundle in his arms. "Morning," he said. "Brought you something." She stepped closer, wrapping her shawl tighter against the desert chill. "You've already paid far too much for meals." "This isn't payment," he said. "It's a gift." He held out the bundle, and she saw it was a fur, thick and luxurious, the pelt of some animal she couldn't identify. "Gets cold here at night, even in summer. This'll keep you warm come winter." Adelaide reached out to touch the fur, impossibly soft under her fingers. "I can't accept this. It's too valuable." "It's a fur," Russell said firmly. "I have dozens more, and I'd rest easier knowing you had something to keep the cold off." "Your room in the boarding house doesn't look too well insulated." "You've seen my room?" she asked, alarmed. "Saw it from the outside," he clarified. "Those walls are thin, Adelaide. You deserve better." "Better costs money I don't have." "Then let me help." She stepped back, shaking her head. "I don't understand what you want from me, Mr. Jennings. You pay in gold for meals worth pennies. You bring me expensive gifts. You ask questions about my circumstances. What is it you're after?" Russell was quiet for a long moment, and in the growing light, she could see the serious set of his features. "I'm after the chance to know you better," he said finally. "I'm after the possibility that maybe a woman like you could see something worthwhile in a man like me. I'm after hope, Adelaide, plain and simple." Her breath caught. "You don't even know me. I know you flavor oatmeal with your own cinnamon because you think the miners deserve something better than what they're given. I know you rise before dawn and work until after dark for wages that are criminal. I know you're alone in a hard town and you're scared, but you keep going anyway. I know enough to want to know more." "Why?" she whispered. "Because I've spent the last 15 years in the mountains, Adelaide. I've been alone so long I forgot what it felt like to want company. Then I walked into that cookhouse and saw you standing there, and something woke up inside me that I thought was long dead." He held out the fur again. "Please take it. No strings, no expectations. Just a gift from someone who admires you." Adelaide took the fur, holding it close. It smelled faintly of pine and smoke, wild and clean. "Thank you," she managed. "You're welcome," Russell said. "Now, I believe you have oatmeal to make, and I have the good fortune to be your first customer of the day." Over the following weeks, Russell became a fixture at the cookhouse. He took every meal there, always paying far more than asked, and gradually, Adelaide began to look forward to his presence. He had a quiet way about him, never intrusive but always there. When one of the miners got drunk and started causing trouble during dinner, Russell stood up, and the sheer size and presence of him was enough to make the man reconsider his actions. When a supply wagon overturned in the street, Russell was there to help right it, his powerful muscles making short work of what would have taken 6 men to accomplish. Adelaide found herself watching for him, found herself taking extra care with the meals she knew he'd eat. She started putting aside the best cuts of meat, the freshest bread. Mrs. Garrett noticed and made snide comments, but Adelaide didn't care. For the first time since her father's death, she felt something other than grief and exhaustion. One evening, after the dinner crowd had cleared, Russell lingered at his table. Adelaide was cleaning up, wiping down the long wooden counter when he approached. "Walk with me," he asked. "Just for a bit. I know you're tired, but I'd like to show you something." Adelaide glanced at Mrs. Garrett, who was counting the day's receipts in the corner with a disapproving frown. "I should finish cleaning." "I'll finish it," said Margaret, one of the other girls who worked at the boarding house. She gave Adelaide a meaningful look. "Go on, you never take a moment for yourself." Adelaide untied her apron, her heart racing. Russell offered his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. His forearm was solid as oak beneath her hand, and she felt small next to him, though she stood 5.5 feet tall herself. He led her through the dusty streets of Panamint as the sun set, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple. They walked past saloons where piano music spilled out into the evening air, past the assay office and the general store, up a winding path that led to the edge of town. There, on a small rise, Russell stopped and gestured to the view. The Panamint Valley spread before them, vast and harsh and beautiful. The mountains rose like sleeping giants, their peaks still touched with snow despite the summer heat. Stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, more stars than Adelaide had ever seen in her life. "This is what I wanted to show you," Russell said quietly. "This is what the world looks like when you step back from the struggle and the noise." "It's beautiful," Adelaide breathed. "It is," he agreed, "but it's also lonely. I've spent years in places like this, Adelaide, beautiful and empty and lonely. I thought that was what I wanted, thought I was meant for solitude. But lately, I've been thinking that maybe beauty is sweeter when you have someone to share it with." She turned to look at him and found him already watching her. "Russell, I know I'm not much," he said, the words coming faster now as if he'd been holding them back. "I'm rough around the edges, not educated, not refined. I spend most of my time in the wilderness, and I don't have a proper home to offer you. But I'm honest, and I'm hardworking, and I would spend every day of my life making sure you never had to cook for Pennies again. I'd give you everything I have, Adelaide, everything I am." "Are you asking what I think you're asking?" she said, her voice shaking. "Not yet," he said. "Not until you've had time to think about it, to know your own mind, but I wanted you to know my intentions. I want to court you properly, Adelaide. I want the chance to prove that I could make you happy." She should have been afraid. She should have been cautious. Instead, she felt something bright and warm unfurling in her chest, something that felt dangerously like hope. "I'd like that," she said softly. "I'd like that very much." His smile transformed his face, making him look younger, less weathered. "Yeah. Yes," she confirmed, and then, emboldened by the look in his eyes, she added, "I've been watching for you every morning, you know, listening for your step. You're the best part of my days." Russell reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face in his large, calloused hand. His touch was impossibly gentle. "You're the reason I've stayed in this town for 3 weeks when I meant to stay for 3 days. You're the reason I'm thinking about building a cabin instead of just camping under the stars. You're changing everything, Adelaide." She leaned into his touch, closing her eyes. "I don't want you to change who you are." "Not changing who I am," he said. "Just becoming who I'm meant to be." "There's a difference." They stood there as the stars came out, talking quietly about everything and nothing. Russell told her about his life in the mountains, about tracking elk and beaver, about nights spent by campfires and mornings waking to frost on his bedroll. Adelaide told him about her childhood in Missouri, about her mother who died when she was 12, about her father's endless optimism, and how it had ultimately led them to Panamint. "You think he'd approve of me?" Russell asked as they finally walked back toward the boarding house. "My father believed every man deserved a chance to prove himself," Adelaide said. "He would have liked that you work hard and speak honestly. He would have worried that you're taking an interest in his daughter, because that's what fathers do, but I think he would have approved." At the door of the boarding house, Russell stopped. "Tomorrow's Sunday," he said. "There's a church service in the morning, such as it is. Would you let me escort you?" "I'd like that," Adelaide said. "And after, maybe we could have lunch somewhere other than the cookhouse. I heard there's a restaurant that just opened, has tablecloths and everything." She laughed. "That sounds wonderful." He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, the gesture so courtly and unexpected that it made her breath hitch. "Sleep well, Adelaide. Good night, Russell." She floated up the stairs to her room, barely noticing Mrs. Garrett's disapproving glare. That night, wrapped in the fur Russell had given her, Adelaide allowed herself to dream about a future that included more than just surviving day to day. Sunday morning arrived bright and hot, the way summer days in the California desert always did. Adelaide put on her best dress, a blue cotton that had seen better days but was at least clean and mended, and tried to do something with her hair beyond the practical bun she usually wore. She managed to coax it into a softer style, with a few curls framing her face, and pinched her cheeks to bring color to them. Russell was waiting outside the boarding house, looking uncomfortable in a clean shirt and with his hair freshly washed and combed back. His eyes lit up when he saw her. "You look beautiful," he said, offering his arm. "You clean up well yourself," she replied, taking it. The church was a rough wooden building that also served as the schoolhouse during the week. The pews were simple benches, and the preacher was a former miner who'd found religion after a near-death experience in a collapsed shaft. But the congregation sang with genuine feeling, and the sermon about finding grace in hardship resonated with Adelaide. She was aware of the looks they received, the whispers behind hands. Russell Jennings escorting the cookhouse girl to church was apparently news worth spreading. But Russell seemed oblivious to the attention, or perhaps he simply didn't care. He sat close enough that their shoulders touched, and when they stood to sing, his deep bass voice blended with her softer alto in a way that made her smile. After the service, they walked to the new restaurant, which turned out to be a somewhat optimistic name for what was essentially a slightly nicer cookhouse. But it did have tablecloths, as promised, and the proprietor seemed pleased to have Russell's business. "Order whatever you want," Russell told Adelaide, "and don't look at the prices. Russell, you can't keep spending money on me like this." "Why not?" he asked, genuinely curious. "I've got more than I need and it makes me happy to spend it on you. But what about your supplies?" "Your plans to head back into the mountains," something flickered across his face. "About that, I've been thinking maybe I don't need to head back right away. Maybe I could stay in Panamint for a while longer." "What about your trapping? Season doesn't start until fall anyway," he said. "And even when it does, there's no law says I have to trap the same places I always have. Plenty of territory closer to here." "You change your plans for me?" Adelaide asked quietly. "Adelaide, I'd change just about anything for the chance to spend more time with you." He reached across the table and took her hand. "I know we haven't known each other long, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. You're what I want." Her heart felt too big for her chest. "I want you too," she admitted. "It scares me how much." "Why does it scare you?" "Because wanting something this much means it can be taken away," she said. "I lost my mother, then my father. I learned that happiness is temporary." Russell's hand tightened on hers. "I can't promise that nothing bad will ever happen," he said. "Life's too uncertain for that, especially out here. But I can promise that I'll do everything in my power to be here for you, to take care of you, to make you happy. That's a promise I can keep." They talked through lunch, the food growing cold on their plates as they lost themselves in conversation. Russell told her about his childhood in Kentucky, about heading west when he was 18 after his parents died of fever. He told her about learning to survive in the wilderness, about the freedom and the hardship of that life. Adelaide told him about her dreams, the ones she'd tucked away as impractical. She'd always wanted to have her own restaurant, a real one, where she could cook food that mattered, where people came not just to fill their bellies but to enjoy a meal. "Why couldn't you do that?" Russell asked. "Because it takes money," she said. "Money I don't have and likely never will." "What if you did have it?" She laughed softly. If I had money, I'd buy a building, fit it out with a proper kitchen. I'd hire help so I wouldn't have to do everything myself. I'd create a menu with variety, with dishes that took time and care. I'd make it a place where people felt welcomed and valued. Russell was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. What if I told you I could make that happen? Russell, no, I wasn't hinting for money. I know you weren't, he said. But I'm serious, Adelaide. I've been trapping and hunting for 15 years. I've sold furs, sold meat, done some prospecting of my own. I've lived rough and spent almost nothing. I've got a fair sum saved, and I can't think of a better use for it than helping you build something you're passionate about. She shook her head. I couldn't accept that. It wouldn't be right. What if we were married? He asked, and the question hung in the air between them. Adelaide's breath stopped. What? Russell stood up, came around the table, and did something that made several other diners gasp. He got down on one knee in front of her, taking both her hands in his. Adelaide Lawson, I know this is fast, and I know you barely know me. But I'm a simple man with simple truths. I know that you're the finest woman I've ever met. I know that I want to spend my life making you smile. I know that the thought of heading back into those mountains without you makes my chest ache. Marry me, Adelaide. Let me help you build your restaurant. Let me be your partner in all things. I'll work hard, I'll provide for you, and I'll love you with everything I have. Marry me. Tears were streaming down her face, and she was aware of every eye in the restaurant fixed on them, but she didn't care. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes, Russell. Yes. He surged to his feet and pulled her into his arms, lifting her clear off the ground and spinning her around while she laughed and cried at the same time. The other diners applauded, and someone called for drinks all around to celebrate. When Russell finally set her down, he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, gentle and sweet and full of promise. Adelaide felt like she was flying, like everything terrible that had happened had been leading to this moment, this man, this impossible joy. I'll make you happy, Russell murmured against her lips. I swear it. You already have, she replied. The next few weeks passed in a blur of planning and preparation. Russell proved to be a man of action. Within days of their engagement, he'd purchased a building on Main Street, a solid structure that had formerly housed a failed general store. He hired workmen to install a kitchen, to build proper counters and shelving, to create a dining area with real tables and chairs. Adelaide worked alongside the builders, designing the layout, planning the menu. Russell deferred to her judgment on everything related to the restaurant, but he was there every day, helping with the heavy work, using his considerable strength to move equipment and materials. Mrs. Garrett had been furious when Adelaide gave notice, accusing her of being ungrateful and scandalous for accepting charity from a man. But the other girls at the boarding house had been happy for her, especially Margaret, who'd helped her pack her few belongings. You deserve this, Margaret had said, hugging her goodbye. You deserve happiness. Russell had rented Adelaide a room at a more respectable boarding house while they waited for the wedding, insisting on propriety even though she could see the effort it cost him to leave her at her door each night. They were married 3 weeks after his proposal, in the same rough church where they'd attended service together, with half the town in attendance. Adelaide wore a new dress, the first new clothing she'd owned in years, made of cream-colored silk that Russell had ordered specially from San Francisco. He wore a new suit that made him look oddly formal, though his long hair and weathered face marked him as a man of the wilderness no matter what clothes he wore. The preacher spoke about partnership and devotion, about building a life together through faith and hard work. When Russell slipped a gold band onto Adelaide's finger, his hands were shaking slightly, and she loved him all the more for his nervousness. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the preacher announced. "Russell, you may kiss your bride." And he did, thoroughly and tenderly, while the congregation cheered. They'd arranged for a small reception at the new restaurant, which wasn't quite finished but was functional enough to host a party. Adelaide had cooked for days, preparing dishes that showcased her skills. There was roasted chicken with herbs, fresh bread with honey butter, vegetable stew that actually had vegetables beyond potatoes and carrots, pies made with dried fruit, and a wedding cake that had taken her 2 full days to prepare. The miners who'd eaten her cooking at the boarding house came and marveled at the transformation. "This is what she could have been making all along," one of them said to Russell, "if that old bat Garrett had given her a proper budget." "Well, now she can cook whatever she wants," Russell replied, his arm around Adelaide's waist. "And you'll all be welcome to come eat it, soon as we officially open." As the evening wore on and guests began to leave, Russell leaned down to whisper in Adelaide's ear, "Ready to go home, Mrs. Jennings?" The name sent a thrill through her. Yes. Home turned out to be a house Russell had been working on in secret, a small but well-built cabin on the outskirts of town, close enough to walk to the restaurant but far enough for privacy. He'd furnished it simply but thoughtfully, with a large bed covered in furs, a kitchen stove, a table and chairs, and even a rocking chair by the fireplace. "I know it's not much," Russell said as he carried her over the threshold, "but it's ours." "It's perfect," Adelaide said, looking around with wonder. "When did you do all this?" "Been working on it at night after you went to bed," he admitted. "Wanted to surprise you." She turned to him, her eyes bright with tears. "You're a good man, Russell Jennings." "I'm a man who loves his wife," he corrected. And then he kissed her again, deeper this time, and Adelaide felt heat unfurl low in her belly. Their wedding night was tender and passionate, Russell's strength tempered with gentleness as he learned her body and she learned his. He was patient with her inexperience, murmuring words of love and encouragement, making sure she found pleasure before taking his own. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the big bed, and Adelaide traced the scars on his chest and arms, evidence of a hard life lived in wild places. "I never thought I could be this happy," she confessed in the darkness. "Neither did I," Russell admitted. "I thought my life was set, that I'd die alone in some mountain pass and the wolves would scatter my bones. Now I've got you and a future I never imagined." "Do you miss it?" she asked. "The mountains, the solitude?" "Sometimes," he said honestly. "The pull is still there, but it's not stronger than the pull toward you, not even close." "If you ever need to go, I'd understand," Adelaide said, though the thought of him leaving made her chest tight. "The only place I need to be is wherever you are," Russell said firmly. "That's home now." The restaurant opened 2 weeks later with Adelaide as head cook and Russell managing the front of house and the business side of things. They'd hired 2 girls to help with serving and cleaning, and Adelaide had hired a young Mexican woman named Rosa who was an excellent cook and eager to learn Adelaide's recipes. The restaurant, which they'd named simply Adelaide's, was an immediate success. Miners who'd eaten Adelaide's cooking at the boarding house came in droves, willing to pay premium prices for quality food. But they also attracted other customers: businessmen, families, even some of the wealthier mine owners who'd previously had to send to San Francisco for decent meals. Adelaide worked long hours, but it was different from the grinding poverty of her time at the boarding house. Now she was building something, creating something meaningful. And Russell was there, a steady presence who could handle difficult customers, lift heavy supplies, and steal kisses from her in the kitchen when no one was looking. 3 months after opening, Adelaide realized she was pregnant. She'd suspected for a few weeks but had been afraid to hope, afraid to jinx it. When she finally told Russell, he'd picked her up and spun her around just like he had when she'd agreed to marry him. "We're going to have a baby," he kept repeating, wonder in his voice. "Adelaide, we're going to be parents. Are you happy?" she asked, suddenly nervous. "Happy doesn't even begin to cover it," he said. "I'm terrified and thrilled and so grateful I can barely stand it." As her pregnancy progressed, Russell became almost comically protective. He insisted she rest more, hired additional help for the restaurant, and hovered whenever she was on her feet for too long. Adelaide found it both touching and occasionally irritating. "I'm pregnant, not an invalid," she told him one evening when he tried to carry a pot of soup for her. "I know," he said, "but you're carrying our child and I can't help wanting to take care of you." "You do take care of me," she said, softening. "You've given me everything, Russell. A home, a business, a future. You've made me happier than I ever thought possible." "You've done the same for me," he said, his hand resting gently on her swelling belly. "I was just existing before I met you, Adelaide. Now I'm living." Their son was born on a cold March morning in 1876, arriving with a lusty cry that announced his presence to the entire household. Russell had paced outside the bedroom while the midwife attended Adelaide, and when he was finally allowed in to meet his child, Adelaide saw tears in his eyes. "He's perfect," Russell whispered, holding the tiny bundle with extreme care, as if afraid his strength might hurt the baby. "He is," Adelaide agreed. They decided to name him after her father. "Robert Jennings. What do you think?" "I think it's a fine name for a fine boy," Russell said. "Thank you, Adelaide. Thank you for him for all of this." Having a baby while running a restaurant proved challenging, but they managed. Rosa proved invaluable, helping care for Robert when Adelaide needed to be in the kitchen. Russell was a devoted father, getting up for night feedings, changing diapers without complaint, and spending his free time with his son. As Robert grew from infant to toddler, the restaurant continued to thrive. They expanded, taking over the building next door and enlarging the dining room. Adelaide trained Rosa to handle most of the cooking, freeing herself to focus on menu planning and special dishes. Russell had proven to have a head for business, managing their accounts and investments with the same careful attention he'd once used to track prey in the mountains. They'd been married 3 years when Adelaide found herself pregnant again. This time, Russell was prepared, though no less excited. Their daughter was born in the summer of 1878, a healthy girl with her father's gray eyes and her mother's blonde hair. "Alice," Adelaide said, holding her daughter for the first time. "After your mother." Russell's mother had been named Alice, and Adelaide had wanted to honor her. Russell's eyes went bright with unshed tears as he nodded. "She would have loved you," he said to Adelaide. "She would have been so proud to have you as a daughter." With 2 children and a successful restaurant, life was full and busy. There were hard moments, certainly. Times when money was tight, when Adelaide was exhausted from sleepless nights with a teething baby, when Russell worried about providing for his growing family. But there were far more good moments. Robert's first steps, taken while reaching for his father. Alice's first laugh, a gurgling sound of pure joy. Sunday mornings when they'd close the restaurant and spend the day as a family, walking in the desert or playing in the yard of their cabin. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Russell took Adelaide back to the spot where he'd first told her his intentions, the rise overlooking the Panamint Valley. The children were with Rosa for the evening, giving them a rare moment alone. "Remember what I said here?" Russell asked as they watched the sun set over the mountains. "You said beauty is sweeter when you have someone to share it with," Adelaide recalled. "I was right," Russell said, "but I had no idea just how much sweeter it could be. Adelaide, these 5 years with you have been the best of my life." You've given me a home, a family, a purpose. You've made me better than I ever thought I could be." "You did the same for me," Adelaide said, leaning against his solid warmth. "I was working for pennies, barely surviving, and you paid in gold. Not just with money, but with your heart, your devotion, your strength. You gave me everything." "We gave each other everything," Russell corrected. "That's what partnership means." They stood there as the stars emerged, the same stars they'd watched on their first evening together, and Adelaide marveled at how much had changed. The frightened, lonely girl she'd been seemed like a different person. Now she was a wife, a mother, a successful businesswoman. And all of it had started with a mountain man who'd walked into her cookhouse and paid in gold for meals worth pennies. The years continued to unfold with their share of joy and sorrow. When Robert was 6 and Alice was 4, Adelaide became pregnant again. This pregnancy was harder than the first two, and the midwife warned her to rest. Russell closed the restaurant for a month, refusing to let Adelaide work, and she'd been too exhausted to argue. Their third child, a son they named Richard, was born small and came into the world struggling to breathe. For 3 terrifying days, they weren't sure he'd survive. Adelaide barely left his side, and Russell wore a path in the floor with his pacing. But Richard was a fighter, and on the 4th day, his breathing steadied and his color improved. "He's got your stubbornness," Russell told Adelaide as she nursed their tiny son. "And your strength," she replied, looking at the baby who'd fought so hard to stay with them. Richard's difficult start made them treasure him all the more, though they loved all their children fiercely. As the children grew, they became part of the restaurant's life. Robert helped his father with simple tasks, learning numbers by counting receipts. Alice charmed customers with her sweet nature. Richard, as he got older, showed an interest in cooking and would stand on a stool next to Adelaide, watching her work. Panamint itself changed over the years. The silver started running out, and some of the miners moved on to other strikes, other dreams. But the town had diversified enough to survive the bust. Adelaide's restaurant, as it had become known despite the sign still saying Adelaide's, was now a landmark. They served ranchers, businessmen, travelers passing through, and the remaining miners. Russell had never gone back to his solitary life in the mountains. He'd occasionally take hunting trips, sometimes bringing Robert with him as the boy got older, teaching him to track and shoot. But he always came home, often earlier than planned, saying he missed his wife's cooking and his children's laughter. On their 10th anniversary, they hosted a party at the restaurant for the entire town. It had become tradition for Adelaide to provide a free meal on special occasions, her way of giving back to the community that had supported their business. During the party, Russell stood up to make a toast. "10 years ago," he said, his deep voice carrying through the crowded room, "I walked into a cookhouse and met a woman who was working for Pennies, feeding miners who barely noticed the care she put into every meal. I paid her in gold because I recognized something precious when I saw it. Today, I want everyone to know that she was worth far more than gold. Adelaide, you're worth everything. You've made my life richer than any strike, any claim, any fortune could. Here's to 10 years and to 50 more." The room erupted in cheers and applause. Adelaide, standing beside her husband with tears in her eyes, looked around at the life they'd built. Their children, healthy and happy. Their restaurant full of friends and neighbors. Their love stronger than ever. "To 50 more," she echoed, raising her glass. The years continued to pass, bringing changes and challenges. When Robert was 15, he announced he wanted to attend university in San Francisco. Adelaide's first instinct was to refuse, to keep her eldest close, but Russell supported the boy's ambition. "We raised him to be independent," Russell reminded her. "To think for himself. We can't hold him back because we'll miss him." So they sent Robert to San Francisco with their blessing and enough money to see him through his education. He wanted to study engineering, fascinated by the machines and structures that were changing the West. Alice, meanwhile, showed a talent for music and a sweet singing voice that reminded Adelaide of better times. Richard, true to his early interest, became Adelaide's right hand in the kitchen, learning her recipes and techniques with passionate dedication. When Adelaide turned 40, Russell surprised her with a second restaurant, this one in the town of Darwin, about 20 miles from Panamint. He'd been planning it for months, working with Richard to design a kitchen that incorporated everything they'd learned from running the first restaurant. "You always wanted to expand," Russell said when he revealed the surprise. "To share your cooking with more people. Now you can." Richard managed the Darwin location, proving himself a capable cook and businessman at just 18. Adelaide split her time between both restaurants, proud of her son and grateful for the partnership she and Russell had built. The turn of the century brought more changes. Panamint was now a quieter place, the wild boomtown days long past. But Adelaide's restaurant remained a constant, a place where people gathered for good food and good company. They'd renovated and expanded several times over the years, and the building that had once been a failed general store was now a thriving establishment known throughout the region. On their 25th anniversary, Russell took Adelaide back to that same overlook where so much had begun. They were older now, lines on their faces and gray in their hair, but the love between them hadn't dimmed. "I've been thinking," Russell said as they sat on the rocks, watching the familiar sunset, "about how this all started. You were feeding miners for pennies and I paid in gold." "Best investment you ever made," Adelaide teased. "Wasn't an investment," Russell said seriously. "It was recognition. I saw value where others saw just service. I saw a woman who deserved better than what she was getting, and I had the means to offer better." "You offered everything," Adelaide said. "Your heart, your strength, your future. The gold was just gold, Russell. What mattered was you." "What mattered was us," Russell corrected. "The choice we both made to take a chance on something that seemed impossible. A mountain man and a cookhouse girl building a life together." Adelaide leaned against him, breathing in the familiar scent of him, leather and smoke and something uniquely Russell. "Do you ever regret it, giving up your freedom, your life in the mountains?" "Never," Russell said firmly. "What I had wasn't freedom, Adelaide. It was just emptiness I'd convinced myself was freedom. Real freedom is choosing who you want to be with, what life you want to build, and I chose you. I'd choose you 1,000 times over." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars emerged, the same stars that had witnessed the beginning of their love story. Adelaide thought about the girl she'd been, desperate and alone, and the woman she'd become. She thought about the mountain man who'd walked into her life and changed everything with his simple recognition of her worth. "I love you," she said. "Then, now, and always." "And I love you," Russell replied. "My cook, my partner, my heart." The years rolled on, bringing grandchildren and new adventures. Robert married a teacher from San Francisco and gave them 3 grandchildren. Alice married a rancher and settled near Darwin, close to Richard's restaurant. Richard married Rosa's daughter Maria, bringing their families even closer together. And they had 4 children who grew up running through the restaurant kitchens just as their father had. Adelaide and Russell grew old together, their love deepening with each passing year. When Adelaide's hands became too arthritic to cook daily, she taught her daughters-in-law and grandchildren her recipes, passing down not just techniques, but the philosophy that had guided her from the beginning. That food made with care was an act of love, and everyone deserved to be fed well. Russell's strength gradually faded, his once powerful muscles growing lean and his steps slowing. But his devotion to Adelaide never wavered. He still walked her to the restaurant every morning, still held her hand, still looked at her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. On their 50th anniversary, their children and grandchildren threw them a celebration that took over both restaurants. The governor of California sent a proclamation honoring their contributions to the state's culinary heritage. Former miners, now old men themselves, came to share stories about Adelaide's cooking in the early days. During the celebration, Russell stood with some difficulty, leaning on a cane, and called for quiet. 50 years ago, he said, his voice not as strong as it once was but still carrying authority, I made the best decision of my life. I asked Adelaide Lawson to marry me, and she said yes. We've had half a century together, and I want everyone to know that she's made every single day better. She took a rough mountain man and made him into a husband, a father, a grandfather. She built a business from nothing, fed thousands of people, and raised 3 remarkable children. Adelaide, you are my greatest treasure. Adelaide stood beside him, tears streaming down her face. And you are mine, she said. You saw me when I was invisible. You valued me when I felt worthless. You loved me when I felt unlovable. You gave me everything, Russell, and I'd do it all again every moment just to be by your side. Their family surrounded them, 3 generations bound by love and legacy. Robert, with his engineering degree, now helping to design restaurants across California. Alice, with her beautiful voice, singing at churches and celebrations. Richard, carrying on his mother's culinary traditions while adding his own innovations. As the party continued into the night, Adelaide and Russell slipped away to their cabin, the same one he'd built for her all those years ago. They'd expanded it over the years, added rooms for growing family, but the core remained the same. They sat together in the rocking chairs Russell had made, looking out at the desert night. The stars were brilliant, diamond bright in the clear air. "Do you remember what you said to me that first time?" Adelaide asked. "When you asked to court me?" "I said you were the reason I'd stayed in town," Russell recalled. "The reason I was thinking about building a cabin instead of camping under the stars." "You also said beauty was sweeter when you had someone to share it with," Adelaide reminded him. "Still true," Russell said, reaching for her hand. "Even more true now." They sat in peaceful silence, hands intertwined, watching the stars wheel overhead. Adelaide thought about the impossible journey that had brought her here, from a desperate cookhouse girl working for pennies to a woman who'd built a legacy of love and family and good food shared generously. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" Russell asked. "For seeing me," Adelaide said. "For choosing me, for loving me." "Thank you for saying yes," Russell replied. "For taking a chance on a rough mountain man who didn't know the first thing about being a husband." "You knew the important things," Adelaide said. "Loyalty, devotion, love. Everything else you learned as you went." "We learned together," Russell corrected. "That's what partnership is." As the night deepened and the desert air grew cool, they eventually made their way inside, helping each other with the small difficulties age had brought. But their spirits were young, their love as fresh as it had been 50 years ago when a mountain man had walked into a cookhouse and recognized something precious. 2 years later, Russell passed quietly in his sleep, Adelaide beside him as she'd been for 52 years. The funeral drew people from across the state, miners and businessmen and family, all coming to pay respects to a man who'd lived with integrity and loved with his whole heart. Adelaide grieved deeply, but without bitterness. She'd had 52 years with the love of her life, had built a family and a business and a legacy with him. She continued running the restaurant for another 3 years, finally retiring at 76 to let Richard and Maria take full control. She spent her final years surrounded by family, teaching her grandchildren and great-grandchildren to cook, telling them stories about their grandfather and the early days in Panamint. She told them about being a cookhouse girl working for Pennies, about the mountain man who'd paid in gold, about building something beautiful from nothing. When Adelaide passed at the age of 81, peaceful and surrounded by love, she was laid to rest beside Russell on the hillside overlooking the Panamint Valley. Their children erected a simple marker that read, Adelaide and Russell Jennings. She fed the miners for pennies, he paid in gold, and together they built a legacy of love. The restaurants continued, passed down through generations, each one maintaining Adelaide's commitment to quality and care. The story of their beginning became family legend, told and retold to each new generation. The cook who worked for Pennies and the mountain man who saw her worth became a symbol of recognition, of seeing value where others saw only service, of love that transformed lives. In the town of Panamint, now a quiet place far from its boomtown days, Adelaide's restaurant still stands, run by her great-great-grandchildren. On the wall hangs a photograph of Adelaide and Russell on their 50th anniversary, standing together in front of the restaurant they'd built. He's still tall and broad, though white-haired, and she's still looking at him with love in her eyes. Beneath the photograph is a small plaque that tells their story, how she cooked for Pennies, how he paid in gold, how they found each other in a rough mining town and built something that lasted long after the silver ran out. It's a reminder that real wealth isn't measured in what you take from the earth, but in what you build with your hands and heart, and in the people you choose to love. The Jennings family still gathers there every year on the anniversary of Russell and Adelaide's first meeting, sharing a meal cooked from her original recipes, telling stories about the mountain man and the cook, and celebrating the legacy of love that started with a simple act of recognition, when one person saw the worth in another and chose to honor it, not with pennies, but with gold and ultimately with everything they had.